when it comes to Islam's sacred history, or rather say the what we know about the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, that we can have relative confidence that the general outlines and perhaps most of the fine details about what we know about his seerah are reliable, but it becomes less reliable the further out we kind of go, with minor exceptions, or maybe
one thing is the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, that is something that was very definitely a concern early on. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the history of the Prophet ﷺ is much better established than the history of the Rashidun caliphs. Mm-hmm. There was much more concern for accuracy of detail early on there because the Muslims really cared about their prophet. Mm-hmm. And so it's said that the Urwa ibn Zubayr had a history of the prophet already. And Urwa ibn Zubayr, of course, is, although he's not a companion, he's a tabi'i because he was born after the Prophet ﷺ had died. But nevertheless, he's a very early person in Islam, an early tabi'i. And so there was already a concern for this that was going on, say, in the latter half or the latter part of the 7th century, or the latter part of the 1st century of the Hijrah. There was already this interest going on. And there was a possibility through the memories of people of remembering a very great deal about it. And so that then is recorded and gathered together by the 5 great sources for the seerah, which are Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi and Al-Maghazi, and Al-Baladhiri in Ansab al-Ashraf, and Al-Tabari in his history, and Ibn Sa'd in his Tabaqat. Mm-hmm. And these are the 5 big sources. And there also are other sources that are not related to those, that are small sources that don't have as much contribution to make. After all, Ibn Sa'd has 2 whole volumes out of the 9 are the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So you have this huge amount of material handed down, and for the later on, it's not as clearly done in the and not done in as much detail, and the disdain that in which the Umayyads were held is shown by the lack of biographical detail for the Umayyad caliphs, even though there was a Umayyad tradition that survived, which is represented partly by or inside of Kitab and Ansab al-Ashraf of al-Baladhiri, for example. But in general, there was a kind of disdain for them. So when I wrote about Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, it's hard to say much about his life in general. I mean, I only, in my whole book about his reign, there were only about 2 pages that were about himself. And, he had this advisor called Al-Abrash al-Kalbi, who was a Syrian Arab there from, the people that supported him, who were the Syrian army. And nothing is known about this person. I mean, hardly anything. And there's also Raja bin Haywa, who had something to do with the caliphate of Omar ibn Abdul Aziz. And as important as that is, also very little is known about this person. And so so the elaboration about the Sahaba tends to be somewhat more. And you can say, yes, definitely the general outline is good. It's clear. One of the attacks of the Cronites, which were the people who were on the offensive against early Islamic history and its accuracy.
With Patricia Crone.
Patricia Crone, the Danish Orientalist. And her collaborator, Michael Cook, for example, and other collaborators of her, and so on, and other people who continue to write in the same vein, was that they said, well, let's just do the thought experiment, reject the entire Islamic tradition and rely only on the non-Islamic sources, which are mainly Middle Eastern Christian historians, all of whom wrote somewhat later. although some of them are really early and very important, like Cebios or Pseudo-Cebios, the Armenian historian, who is thought to have written around the year 660. That would be just about 30 years after the Prophet ﷺ had died. Very important. But what does Pseudo-Cebios say in his Armenian history? First of all, he's in Armenia, which is far away, so you wouldn't expect that would contain anything much accurate. But on the contrary, he has the campaign of Mu'tah in the thing, where he says that the Muslim invasion of Syria originally appeared at Rabath, Moab, which is today Rabbah, which is the town that's just a stone's throw from Mu'tah, the location of that battle site. It's an exact agreement. And then they would try to say, oh, Cebios proves the blah, blah, blah. No, it doesn't. It proves the opposite. It proves the Muslim historical tradition is accurate. One of Krona's students, Robert Hoyland, wrote a book, I think titled Islam as Others Saw It, in which he gathered all the sources, the non-Muslim sources for the early period in Islam for the first 100 years of the Hijrah or so. And he gathered all the historical sources, everything, and he wrote and translated them. So it's all found translated, every single thing. You can read every single thing that all these other sources said. And then he also put in as an appendix in the very same volume all the early Muslim inscriptions and contemporary things. So he left out later historians. He only included the early stuff, see. And it doesn't produce a different narrative at all. And he said that. He said, well, looking at all this, it doesn't really produce a different narrative from the Muslim historical narrative. I mean, there's some, he would say, you know, because these were Christian writers and some of them disliked the Muslims, and so they may have said some unfavorable things here and there. But on the whole, there's nothing that goes against the mainstream historical tradition of Islam. And I myself, looking at these things, I fail to see anything that goes against that